So as Jakob mentioned, my name is Andrea and I work at the World Business Council for Sustainable Development in Geneva. And we're an organization that is of 200 global companies. Generally, we're CEO-led, and we essentially provide a platform for companies to engage around sustainable development initiatives that really allow them to obviously do their business better. So you might wonder why there's a picture of Sidney Crosby scoring the winning goal in the Canada-US gold medal Olympic game. Last night I was sort of trying to come up with an image that sort of captured what I think we all want out of this and out of, summits like these and initiatives like the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. And I think this, as a good Canadian, sort of popped into my head. And so personally, I sort of think that what we want is really sort of captured in this image, and what this is really essentially the result of what we want for corporate carbon management practices broadly. And so how do we do this? Well, we need really a methodology that can help enable the scaling up of corporate carbon management practices that lead to transformative improvements in greenhouse gas emissions. So to do that, we really need a methodology that's globally accepted, not only by business, but also by policymakers, by NGOs, reporting programs, academics, and other stakeholders. And so we'll get into more detail around what our role is within that field, and some more details around the specifics on the methodology that we're developing. But really, what's the role of a methodology in enabling this transformative change? And I think there's sort of a number of factors, and one of them is really that providing a consistent framework for companies to engage with other companies and other stakeholders can really sort of lead to a diffusion of carbon management practices throughout the supply chain. And obviously that needs to scale up on a massive level for us to be able to get the sort of reductions that we need in the next number of years. And a methodology can also really mainstream carbon management practices within a company and provide a common language for which business units within a company can engage around product design or reporting, or engagement with sort of the strategic level of the company. And so it's sort of embedding that sort of life cycle thinking within a company that we think a methodology can help do. Additionally, a common methodology will hopefully also bring the cost down of a company doing an inventory. So if they can comply with one methodology rather than multiple methodologies, of course that's going to bring the cost down and essentially enable a company to spend more time on reduction rather than sort of compliance in this area. And so I think sort of those are just a couple. I think we heard about benchmarking from Guido earlier, and of course that's another very important goal that I think a methodology can help lead to, and of course the product category rules and other sort of more specific guidance. So sort of adding all of these things together, I think really what we need is something that just makes it easier and simpler for companies to be able to do carbon management and to really then enable that scaling up that we need, and hopefully end up in a result sort of like this. And if you're Canadian, you'd know what I'm talking about. So I'm going to touch upon a couple things in our presentation. First is just to give a quick overview of what the GHG Protocol Initiative is. I think probably many of you are familiar with that, but for those of you that aren't, it just provides a bit of context around where we've come from in this area. Also an introduction to the product and scope 3 standards, and then just a quick overview about our standard development process. I think we're actually going to have a break after that, and then we have 3 road testing presentations. So from 3 of the over 60 companies that we've had road testing the draft standards, we'll hear from 3 of them and their experiences. And then I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Laura from the World Resources Institute, and she's going to talk about an overview of the key requirements, basically summarizing how we've updated the draft standards based upon the road testing feedback and other feedback that we've received. And then touching upon the next steps. So where have we come from? Well, we've actually been in partnership with the World Resources Institute since 1998 under what we call the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Initiative. And essentially that initiative has a mission to develop internationally accepted greenhouse gas accounting and reporting standards and to promote their use worldwide. And this has always been a multi-stakeholder partnership, and we essentially convene a process which brings together businesses, NGOs, governments, academics, and others to develop these standards. And the first one that we developed is the Greenhouse Gas Protocol Corporate Standard, which we released in 2001 and then revised in 2004. And essentially over that time, it's been adopted by a number of programs around the world, such as the Carbon Disclosure Project and the Climate Registry and others, and has really become the sort of de facto international standard for carbon accounting at the corporate level. All of our standards and tools are available free on our website at ghgprotocol.org. And we did a survey over 2 years ago just to assess the needs of our stakeholders, because we had a number of stakeholders coming to both of our organizations saying, we need new standards. And so we went out to them and said, well, what is it that you actually need, and how can, is this the right place for us to work on that? And really what we found was that there was just an enormous increase in the number of corporate value chain and life cycle management initiatives that were happening out there. And that's since, I think, increased probably tenfold since then. So if you look at, I think we'll hear from a number of them today, and there's a number of other sort of company-specific and regional-specific initiatives that are out there. And so companies were saying, what we want is really one methodology that we can comply by as an international company. And at the same time, there's just been an increase in the number of requests for GHG data that's related to the broader supply chain. So it's kind of going outside of the corporate boundary at this point, and more and more stakeholders are increasingly interested in the carbon management practices of companies sort of beyond their immediate control. There's also been a general increase in the inclusion of value chain and life cycle emissions in the reporting of many companies, and as well as in their reduction goals. So really what all of this added up to was that we understood there was a need from our stakeholders to develop an internationally standardized approach to measuring and reporting emissions in the value chain. So we proceeded ahead with the development of 2 standards in early 2008. One is on product lifecycle emissions, and one is on corporate value chain emissions. And the Scope 3 corporate value chain standard, the goal of this is essentially to help quantify GHG emissions in the value chain at the company or organization level, and to understand and manage these emissions and to publicly report them. And if you're familiar with the corporate protocol, then you would be familiar with this, and we saw this already once today. And essentially, the standard is based around the framework of the corporate standard, but trying to sort of put some more structure through requirements and guidance around this blue arrow, which is the value chain emissions, essentially, of a company. So it's the sort of big bucket of everything else. And just as a short introduction to the Scope 3 standard, as I said, if you're familiar with corporate accounting, you would know that the emissions from your own operations within your corporate boundary are considered Scope 1. And the electricity that you purchase to run those operations is considered Scope 2. But of course, there's lots of other activities that a company is engaged in through the products that they purchase, through the operations that they lease, through business travel, etc. So essentially, everything that a company purchases can be considered upstream emissions. And what we've done, and we'll talk about further throughout our time, is the different categories of emissions that we've outlined. So we've outlined 9 separate categories for upstream emissions. These kind of range from purchased goods and services, capital goods, waste, business travel, employee commuting, etc. And of course, there's downstream emissions from the products that a company sells. So again, these are included in Scope 3 emissions, and we've categorized these into different categories from the transportation and distribution of sold products, processing of sold products, use of sold products, disposal, etc. We also have, of course, the product standard, and the goal of the product lifecycle standard is to quantify the GHG emissions of a single product over its lifetime. So while the corporate standard looks at sort of the big picture corporate emissions, this is looking at one single product's lifecycle emissions over its lifetime. And the goal is to understand, manage, and publicly report these emissions, and it's based on current existing life cycle assessment standards such as ISO. So many people kind of wonder how these standards fit together and how they sort of complement one another. And this is going to be a very simplified example. So if you have one company that perhaps makes two products, you would have the emissions from the life cycle of those two products. Now, if you were to add up the production emissions of those two products, you would have the reporting companies Scope 1 and 2 at the corporate level. And if you were to look and add up the sort of cradle-to-gate emissions of the production of those two products, you would have the upstream Scope 3 emissions. And then if you look at what happens from the gate onwards through end of life, and you added up those products' emissions, then you would have the downstream Scope 3 emissions. However, there are some additional categories that are sort of common in corporate accounting, such as business travel, capital goods, employee commuting, etc. So those are some additional Scope 3 activities that happen at the corporate level. And if you were to add up all of these buckets, so the emissions from product 1, the emissions from product 2, the other Scope 3 emissions, you could, in theory, have total corporate emissions. Now, the sort of flip side of looking at that is to sort of, instead of taking a bottom-up approach, take a top-down approach and look at your corporate emissions to see where the largest impacts are within perhaps a product category, and then to sort of deep dive into that and do a product life cycle inventory of that to understand how you can improve the life cycle emissions of a specific product or product category. So the two standards have a number of business goals that we believe can be achieved by undertaking an inventory. One that we've heard of a lot, and I think we'll hear throughout the discussion the next 2 days, is the engaging suppliers and enabling supply chain GHG management. So it's a bit of what I talked about before, so providing a sort of common framework and language from which you can then engage with your suppliers and enable more supply chain carbon management. Another business goal is to understand the risks and opportunities associated with emissions in the entire value chain. So with extremely volatile resource prices, a company could undertake an inventory to understand what the risks are associated with that, and then perhaps make some changes through product design or different efficiency gains. And of course, one of the main goals is to identify GHG reduction opportunities and then prioritize those reduction efforts, and to set some Scope 3 or product level reduction targets, and then to track that performance over time. And finally, improving credibility and transparency in reporting. So engaging with your stakeholders in terms of publicly reporting your emissions and your targets and your performance of that. So in terms of our process in this area, we have a rather sort of robust process to develop these standards. The sort of middle big boxes there are the technical working groups. And so we had around 160 different stakeholders from business, NGOs, academics, governments, and others engaged in really developing the draft standards for about a period of a year. Periodically, those went out to a broader stakeholder advisory group. Again, it's multi-stakeholder, and there's around 1,400 different people engaged in that. So they were able to provide comments throughout the process, provide their feedback on the draft standards. We've just completed a road testing with 60 different organizations, and we'll hear from 3 of those today. So essentially those 60 companies implemented the draft standards within their organizations, and then were able to provide us with very specific and detailed feedback on what worked, what didn't, how to improve them, what were the main challenges, how did they impact your business goals, etc. And at the top, the green box is our steering committee. And again, that's a multi-stakeholder group of 25 different members in trying to engage really the leaders in this area. And they've been engaged throughout the process to really sort of be a checks and balances type of approach and be able to sort of steer and provide guidance on the overall development of the draft standards. And just our overall timeline, as I said, we started this process in late 2007 with a survey. And really, we got underway in 2008 with the first steering committee meeting and the first technical working group meeting. And we've really come leaps and bounds since then, I have to say, being at that first set of meetings. And I think over time, we've really tried to, through lots and lots and lots of discussion, sort of bring the differing viewpoints together into some kind of common ground and common approach. So as you can see, we've had a number of different steering committee meetings, technical working group meetings, stakeholder comment periods. We held 5 workshops around the world at about this time last year, 1 in Berlin, 1 in London, Beijing, Guangzhou, and Washington, D.C. And the intent of that was to, again, engage this broader stakeholder group and make sure that we're getting as much feedback and consultation as possible. As I've said, we completed the road testing just a few months ago, and that ran from January until June, and we had over 60 companies implementing the draft standards in their organizations. We're just in the final stages of updating the second draft standards. They should be out in about a week. And again, that's going to go to a 30-day public comment period, and Laura will talk more about how you can engage in that process. And following that, we hope to, again, gather feedback and then update them a final time and finalize them by hopefully the end of this year, if not early 2011. So as I said, we did have a sort of broad stakeholder comment period. The first one ran from November 11th to December 21st, and we received feedback from 63 different organizations. All of the feedback that we've been approved to put publicly on our website is available there, so you're free to sort of access it and review what others are saying and thought. And again, as I said, we'll have another public comment period that starts in about a week or so, and that will be a 30-day public comment period. And anyone is really able to provide their feedback into this process through that mechanism. I've touched upon the road testing a few times, and as I said, we've just completed the road testing in the summer. And we had 62 companies from 19 countries and I think about 20 different sectors road testing the standards. And you can just sort of see the geographical spread there. And just some sort of high-level feedback. Generally, the feedback from the road testing was very positive, which was good because we were a little worried at times. So we've had very good positive feedback, and many people felt that the standards really did help them, not only engage with others throughout their company, but also just understand and have some sort of surprising results of where those emissions are sometimes. And I think what surprised us as well was that we heard quite overwhelmingly that wherever possible, the standards should actually be more specific, which would allow for better standardization across inventories, and also sometimes take that need for expert judgment away. And hopefully that more specificity will allow more and more companies to engage in carbon management and developing a carbon inventory, because the instructions of how to do that would be more specific. We also heard that supplier emissions was a major business goal of many companies. Not every single company, but many companies felt that this was very important to them, which is how to engage and account for their supplier emissions. I think probably no surprise, but we heard that data collection is likely the largest challenge of completing inventory for both standards. And lastly, nearly last, is that we should provide some more linkages and consistency between the product and Scope 3 standard. So making sure that the explanation of how the two standards fit together and how one company can utilize both standards is more explicit. And lastly, just that there needs to be some more general knowledge of life cycle assessment in corporate inventories, especially in developing countries. And so we've tried to sort of capture that through providing more guidance just around life cycle concepts, additional guidance on some of the additional areas of life cycle thinking that is required to do an inventory. So that's it for my presentation. Essentially, my role was really to sort of capture the process and some high-level feedback on the stakeholder review process and the road testing process. And after the break, I believe we're going to hear from 3 of the road testers, and then Laura from WRI is going to capture in more detail how we've updated the draft standards based upon all of this feedback. So that's it for me.
Thank you, Andrea.